My sister looked me dead in the eye and told me I simply was not classy enough to attend her wedding. My mother patted my hand and told me to just let her enjoy her big day. So I stayed away. I never showed up. But that evening, every news channel in the country was replaying the exact moment her flawless groom struck her across the face in front of hundreds of horrified guests. I sat on my private balcony quietly, finished my glass of vintage wine, and smiled. I knew exactly what had happened. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Rebecca, 34 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful financial consultant, I quietly escaped their toxic dynamic years ago, but maintained occasional contact. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago meant appearances were everything to my parents, Barbara and Thomas. Our sprawling home was a fortress of expectations I could never meet. I maintained straight A's and joined honor societies, but nothing I did could ever compete with my younger sister Courtney. At 28 years old, Courtney was the undisputed golden child. She effortlessly charmed everyone. My parents constantly showered her with praise, celebrating her mediocre achievements while ignoring my milestones. I was the quiet daughter who wore thrift store clothes by choice. They viewed my practical nature as an embarrassment. My father owned a logistics company and measured human worth entirely by income. My mother functioned as his eager social director, obsessed with securing our status among the local elite. This lifelong dynamic culminated last month during a tense family dinner at an exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago. The restaurant was a temple of old money elegance, with dim lighting and dark mahogany walls. I wore a simple black dress, avoiding the flashy designer labels my mother and sister worshipped. My parents insisted on this dinner to celebrate Courtney's upcoming nuptials to Harrison, a man from a prominent family. I sat across from my sister, listening to her brag about the extravagant details of her destination wedding. Courtney spent the first hour dominating the conversation. She detailed the imported silk of her custom gown, the ridiculous cost of her 5-tier cake, and the exclusive guest list. I offered polite smiles, trying to be supportive, despite the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I recognized the signs of an impending ambush. My mother kept shooting me judgmental glances. My father spent the evening ordering expensive wine, laughing loudly at Courtney's jokes, and ignoring my attempts to participate in the conversation. As waiters cleared our dinner plates, the atmosphere shifted. The light chatter abruptly stopped. Courtney reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope with gold-embossed lettering. She did not hand it to me with a smile. Instead, she placed her manicured fingers on the thick paper and slowly slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it rested directly in front of my plate. I looked down at the envelope, assuming it was my formal invitation to the wedding. I reached out and broke the wax seal, sliding the thick cardstock free. It was not a wedding invitation. It was a printed spreadsheet. I stared at the paper, my mind struggling to process the neat columns of numbers. It was an itemized bill. Courtney had calculated the exact cost of my appetizer, my steak, my side dishes, and the single glass of wine I had consumed. Tucked behind the invoice was a formal letter printed on the same expensive stationery. I read the words, feeling the blood drain from my face. It was a notice of uninvitation, formally requesting my absence. I looked up, meeting Courtney's icy blue eyes. She did not look guilty. She looked triumphant. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, making sure her voice carried clearly to the neighboring tables, where well-dressed couples were dining. "I think we both know this is for the best," Rebecca Courtney stated loudly, her tone dripping with condescension. "Harrison's family is very elite. They come from old money, and they are expecting a certain caliber of guests at this event. Frankly, your entire aesthetic is just too low class for the kind of wedding we are hosting. I cannot have you showing up in your thrift store cardigans and cheap shoes, mingling with his relatives. It would be a complete embarrassment to the family. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to remain completely still. I did not cry. I did not scream. Years of enduring their emotional abuse had taught me how to lock my feelings away in a secure vault. I simply listened as she continued her surgical dismantling of my character. "And let us be honest about your career," she added, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You are a freelance accountant. You work from home in sweatpants. What are you possibly going to talk about with Harrison's parents? Their yacht club memberships? Their real estate portfolios? You do not fit in our world, Rebecca. You never have. I need my special day to be perfect, and having you there looking uncomfortable is a risk I am not willing to take. You can pay your portion of the dinner, and we can go our separate ways." The sheer audacity of her cruelty hung in the air heavy and suffocating. I looked at my mother and father, expecting them to intervene, to tell Courtney she had gone too far. Instead, my father took a slow sip of his wine, looking anywhere but at me, while my mother offered me a patronizing smile that somehow hurt worse than Courtney's words. They were entirely on her side. They had planned this together. I was the family embarrassment, the stain on their perfect social facade, and they were finally scrubbing me out. I looked down at the itemized bill, which totaled exactly $142.50. A slow, chilling calm washed over me. They truly believed I was a struggling low-tier freelancer, barely scraping by. They had no idea that my accounting business was actually a highly lucrative stealth private equity firm. They had no idea I managed portfolios worth millions. Without a word, I opened my plain leather purse. I bypassed my standard bank cards and pulled out a solid metal black card, cool to the touch. I placed it directly on top of Courtney's itemized bill. The metal made a sharp clink against the mahogany table. Courtney looked at the card, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in confusion. She scoffed, rolling her eyes as she leaned back. "What is this, Rebecca, a prepaid debit card? Or did you buy a fake metal card online to look impressive? You cannot afford this restaurant. Do not embarrass yourself further. Just pay and leave." I did not break eye contact. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, letting her arrogant assumptions hang in the air. She had no idea who she was dealing with or the storm she had just unleashed. The cost of their arrogance would be everything they held dear. Courtney's laughter hung in the air, a sharp, grating sound that drew curious glances from the neighboring tables. She flicked the heavy black card with her manicured fingernail, her face twisted in a mask of pure amusement. She was waiting for me to break, waiting for the familiar shame to wash over me just as it had when we were teenagers, and she would mock my sensible shoes or my quiet weekends studying. But the shame never came. Instead, I just looked at her, my silence stretching out and turning her smug laughter into something slightly more uncertain. Before she could launch into another volley of insults, my mother lunged into the fray. Barbara never missed an opportunity to shield her golden child from even the slightest hint of discomfort, even when that discomfort was entirely self-inflicted. My mother reached across the table, her diamond bracelets clinking against the mahogany. She grabbed the cream-colored envelope containing my invitation and shoved it roughly back toward my side of the table. It slid over the polished wood and bumped against my water glass. "Just let her enjoy her big day, Rebecca," my mother hissed, her voice a harsh whisper designed to scold me without attracting the attention of the restaurant manager. "You have always been so bitter about your sister's happiness. You know how important this wedding is to our family. We need everything to be absolutely flawless for Harrison's parents. They're flying in from Europe, and we simply cannot afford any distractions or awkward moments. I stared at the woman who had brought me into this world. I was not a distraction. I was her daughter. But in her eyes, I was merely a liability, a poorly dressed prop that did not fit the aesthetic of the high society production she was staging. My father Thomas sat beside her, methodically cutting his prime rib as if this were just another Tuesday night dinner. He did not look up, but he offered his own contribution to the assault. "Your mother is right, Rebecca," he said, chewing slowly. "You have to understand the level of investment we are making here. This is not just a party. It is a merging of two very prominent families. In fact, your mother and I are taking out a second mortgage on the Newport Lake house next week just to cover the floral arrangements. $150,000 just for the orchids and imported peonies. We cannot have you sitting in the corner looking miserable while we are putting everything on the line to give Courtney the wedding of her dreams." The words hit me, but not in the way they intended. $150,000 for flowers. A second mortgage on the Newport Lake house. I kept my face completely paralyzed, masking the absolute shock that was currently rewiring my brain. They were talking about the sprawling coastal property in Rhode Island that had been in my father's family for 3 generations. It was their pride and joy, the ultimate symbol of their wealth and status. It was the place where Courtney had spent her teenage summers, hosting lavish boat parties, while I stayed behind in Chicago to work at a local accounting firm. It was the anchor of their entire social identity. But there was a massive, glaring problem with my father's grand financial strategy. He did not own the Newport Lake house anymore. 2 years ago, my parents had quietly faced total financial ruin. Decades of maintaining a millionaire lifestyle on a dwindling corporate salary, combined with funding Courtney's endless luxury vacations, designer wardrobes, and failed boutique business ventures, had finally caught up with them. They had defaulted on their primary mortgage, maxed out their credit lines, and the bank was quietly preparing to seize their assets, starting with the Newport property. They had hidden it from everyone, terrified of the social humiliation of bankruptcy. They had hidden it from their country club friends, from Courtney, and especially from me. They had hidden the crisis from me because they assumed their low-tier freelance accountant daughter could never understand it. What they did not know was that my firm specialized in distressed real estate and debt workouts. When the bank prepared to foreclose, one of our funds purchased the mortgage and related liens at a discount. Through outside counsel, the holding company offered Thomas a confidential alternative to a public foreclosure transfer, title by deed, in lieu, eliminate the remaining deficiency and remain in the house under a subsidized 2-year lease with a limited option to repurchase if the debts were cured. Thomas signed the agreement. He told Barbara and Courtney that an anonymous lender had merely refinanced the property, but the recorded deed transferred legal ownership to my holding company. For 2 years, the payments they called a mortgage were actually reduced lease payments made to my company. They kept using the Newport house because I allowed it, not because they retained equity. Any legitimate lender would discover the ownership transfer in a routine title search, which made their plan for a second mortgage impossible. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They were willing to leverage their entire financial future to literally risk homelessness just to ensure Courtney had imported peonies for her perfect day with her perfect groom. Meanwhile, they were discarding me like expired milk. I looked at my father, who was now wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, looking incredibly satisfied with his little speech about family investment. He truly believed he was the master of his domain, the wealthy patriarch making tough but necessary sacrifices for his golden child. He looked so proud of his ability to provide this extravagant lifestyle for Courtney, completely blind to the fact that his financial foundation was a hollow shell that I was silently holding up. I glanced back at my mother. She was adjusting her posture, her eyes darting around the restaurant to ensure no one of importance had witnessed our incredibly tense exchange. She reached over and gently patted Courtney's hand, offering a reassuring smile that completely ignored the emotional devastation they were attempting to inflict upon me. They were offering up a phantom property to fund a toxic illusion. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with unspoken history. In that suspended moment, the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty quietly snapped. The blind devotion I had harbored, the secret hope that my parents might one day appreciate my silent sacrifices, evaporated entirely. They had drawn their line in the sand, and they had placed me firmly on the outside. It was time for me to finally stop protecting them from themselves. I would fully let them fall. I pushed my chair back. The heavy wood scraped the polished floor. Courtney blinked, her haughty expression faltering as she looked up. My father stopped chewing. My mother's hand froze mid-air over her wineglass. They were waiting for the inevitable explosion. They were waiting for me to cry, to plead for a place in photos that would be framed on the mantle I secretly owned. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I signaled our waiter. He had been hovering nervously near the service station, clearly aware of the tension radiating from our table. He hurried over, his eyes darting between Courtney's itemized bill and my face. I picked up the black card and held it out. "I will be taking care of the entire check this evening," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Please run this for the full amount and add a 30% gratuity." The waiter nodded, quickly pulling a payment terminal from his apron. Courtney let out a sharp breath. She crossed her arms. "You are going to max out your credit limit just to prove a point, Rebecca. That is exactly the pathetic behavior I am talking about. You cannot afford to pay for premium steaks and imported wine on a freelance budget. Just pay your portion and go away." I ignored her completely. I did not even look in her direction. The waiter inserted the metal card into the machine. It processed for less than a second before a cheerful beep confirmed the transaction was approved. I signed the digital screen with a swift motion and handed the device back. "Thank you," I told him. He thanked me and practically sprinted away. I turned my attention back to my family. My father was staring at the space where the waiter had just been, a crease forming between his brows. He knew what a genuine high-net-worth card looked like. The gears in his head were slowly turning, but his arrogance blocked him from reaching the logical conclusion. My mother simply frowned, annoyed that my exit was not following her script. I picked up my purse. I looked at Courtney one last time. "Enjoy your wedding, Courtney. I genuinely hope it is everything you have ever dreamed of. I hope the imported peonies are absolutely beautiful." I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked away. My posture was straight, my steps were calm. I navigated through the maze of candlelit tables and elegantly dressed diners. The heavy oak doors swung open, and I stepped out into the crisp Chicago night. The cool autumn wind hit my face instantly, clearing the stifling atmosphere of the steakhouse from my lungs. The city noises surrounded me, the hum of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the low murmur of pedestrians. It felt incredibly grounding. I took a deep breath, inhaling the reality of my actual life. A sleek black town car was idling at the curb just a few feet away. My driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door. "Good evening, Ms. Wilson." He greeted me with a respectful nod. "How was dinner?" "It was highly educational," I replied, as I slid into the spacious leather back seat. "Please take me home." He closed the door quietly, shutting out the noise of the city. I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes for a single moment. I had finally walked away. There was no going back now, and the realization brought an overwhelming wave of relief instead of grief. I opened my eyes and reached into my purse for my phone. The screen illuminated the dim cabin. I tapped on my contacts and selected a number on speed dial. The phone rang twice before it was answered. "David, I need you to initiate a hard lockdown on a specific asset immediately," I said, skipping any polite greetings. My wealth manager was used to my late-night calls. He worked for my private equity firm and handled the most sensitive parts of my personal portfolio. "Good evening, Rebecca," David replied, his voice completely alert. "Which asset are we discussing?" "The Newport Lake House," I said, staring out the tinted window at the passing city lights. "My parents are attempting to leverage it. They plan to take out a second mortgage to fund Courtney's wedding expenses. They actually think they still own the equity free and clear." I heard rapid typing on David's end. "That is legally impossible," he said. "Our holding company is the recorded owner. Any bank that performs even a preliminary title search will see that your parents have no equity to pledge and no authority to place a new lien on the property. Their application will fail before underwriting begins." "I know," I replied, "but I do not want them approaching predatory lenders or attempting to file altered documents. Activate the title monitoring service and flag every affiliated lender. If anyone submits a deed lien or home equity request bearing their names, our legal team responds immediately." "Consider it done," David replied. "I am placing an alert on the county recording index and circulating the ownership file to our counsel and servicing team. No transfer or lien can be accepted from your parents because they are not the owners, but we will challenge any attempted filing the moment it appears." "Good," I said. "Let them discover the truth through the same paperwork they have ignored for years." "David, I have a secondary request for you," I said. "I need you to pull complete financial dossiers on my sister's groom, Harrison, and his immediate family. Leave no stone unturned. I want a deep dive into their corporate holdings, personal assets, and hidden liabilities. Dig into the family trust accounts. Check for offshore movements or undeclared debts. I want a microscopic view of their financial reality. I find it incredibly hard to believe that a genuinely wealthy, secure family would demand the bride's parents foot a massive bill for luxury floral arrangements and destination venue fees. Something about Harrison's financial situation feels hollow. I want to know exactly what kind of prestigious elite family I am supposedly too low class to mingle with." "We will trace every single hidden dollar," David assured me. I ended the call and let the phone drop into my lap as the car approached my luxury high-rise building. I looked up at the towering glass structure. My parents thought they had protected their pristine image by cutting me out. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact motivation I needed to tear their entire illusion down to the foundation. I was going to let them plan their extravagant party. I was going to let them invite their hundreds of elite guests. I was going to sit back and watch them try to pay for it with money they did not have. And when the truth about Harrison finally came to light, I would be the one holding all the cards. The crisp morning sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate office felt like a fresh start. I sat behind my marble desk sipping a perfectly brewed espresso while reviewing the preliminary data David had sent over during the night. The view of the Chicago skyline from my private equity firm was breathtaking, a daily reminder of the empire I had built entirely on my own. My assistant had just placed a fresh stack of financial dossiers on my desk, detailing the initial highly questionable findings regarding Harrison and his supposedly elite family. I was just beginning to highlight a series of alarming offshore bank transfers when my personal cell phone vibrated sharply against the marble surface. It was not a standard text message or a phone call. It was a high-priority push notification from the dedicated security server that monitored my downtown penthouse. The screen flashed red, indicating a perimeter breach in my private home office. I set down my pen and picked up the device, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady. I had spared no expense when installing the smart home system. It utilized military-grade encryption and high-definition hidden cameras in every room, alongside motion sensors and biometric locks. My parents had a spare keycard to the building, but a lingering courtesy from a time when I still foolishly believed we might have a normal family relationship. However, that keycard was only programmed to grant access to the guest wing and the main living areas. My home office was strictly off-limits, protected by an additional keypad that required my specific passcode. I opened the security application and tapped on the live camera feed for the office. The high-definition video loaded instantly, displaying my private sanctuary in crisp, full-color detail. I watched in absolute silence as the screen revealed two incredibly familiar figures moving frantically around the room. My mother, Barbara, and my sister, Courtney, were physically rummaging through my most private space. Courtney was wearing a designer trench coat, her blonde hair perfectly styled, yanking open the drawers of my vintage oak desk. She tossed client files, personal notebooks, and expensive stationery onto the floor with careless disregard. My mother was standing near the far wall, her hands frantically running along the edges of the built-in bookshelves. They looked less like a wealthy socialite and an elite bride, and more like desperate scavengers tearing apart a stranger's home. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, simply watching the live feed, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of the scene unfolding on my screen. They were treating my apartment with the same profound lack of respect they had always shown my boundaries. I watched as my mother finally noticed a slight indentation behind a framed abstract painting. She pushed the heavy frame aside, revealing the brushed steel face of my hidden wall safe. "Found it!" My mother hissed, her voice picking up clearly on the high-sensitivity microphones hidden in the ceiling. "Get over here, Courtney. Help me guess the combination." Courtney abandoned the desk, stepping over my scattered belongings, and hurried to my mother's side. "Try her birthday," Courtney suggested, her voice laced with obvious annoyance. "Or maybe her college graduation year? She is so obsessed with her boring little accounting business, she probably used the date she incorporated." I watched my mother punch in a series of numbers. The keypad flashed a harsh red light, accompanied by a low, buzzing error tone. My mother let out an exasperated sigh, slapping her palm against the steel door. "Try again," she muttered. "Try my birthday." She always was desperate for my approval. Maybe she used my birth year. The psychological weight of that statement hit me. But it did not wound me. It just confirmed everything I had already accepted the night before. They genuinely believed I was a pathetic, lonely woman who built her entire life around seeking their validation. They were standing in a multi-million-dollar penthouse, actively attempting to commit a felony against their own flesh and blood, and yet they still viewed themselves as the superior beings in the room. I watched them enter 3 more incorrect combinations. The safe was designed to completely lock down after 5 failed attempts, but I did not want to wait for the automated security protocol to engage. I had seen enough. It was time to let them know exactly how exposed they were. I tapped the microphone icon on my phone screen, activating the two-way audio intercom system wired throughout the penthouse. I took a slow, deep breath, ensuring my voice was entirely devoid of any emotion, any panic, or any fear. "If you enter 1 more incorrect code, the system will automatically dispatch the Chicago Police Department for an active burglary in progress." My voice boomed through the hidden speakers in the home office, echoing off the high ceilings like a voice from the sky. On the video feed, the reaction was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying. Courtney shrieked, physically jumping backward away from the safe. She stumbled over a stack of files she had thrown on the floor and nearly lost her balance. My mother gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she whipped her head around, frantically searching the corners of the room for a camera she would never be able to spot. "Rebecca," my mother stammered, her eyes wide with sudden terror as she stared at a blank wall. "Where are you? Are you in the apartment?" "I am sitting at my desk at work," I replied, my tone casual, as if I were discussing the weather rather than a home invasion. "I am currently watching you and Courtney vandalize my private office in high definition." You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why you are attempting to break into my secure wall safe before I press the panic button on my end and send a squad car to my address. The panic on the screen was palpable. My mother smoothed down her expensive blouse, her chest heaving as her mind raced to construct a plausible lie. She plastered on that same fake patronizing smile she had used at the steakhouse the night before, desperately trying to regain the upper hand. "Rebecca, darling, please do not overreact," my mother said, pitching her voice louder to ensure the hidden microphones picked it up. "There is no need for threats or police. We are family. We were just coming by to borrow something for a few hours. You were not answering your phone this morning, and it was a bit of an emergency." I leaned closer to my phone, my expression hardening. "You broke into my locked office to borrow something from a steel safe. What kind of emergency requires you to ransack my desk?" Courtney stepped forward, crossing her arms defensively, her initial shock rapidly transforming back into her default state of entitlement. "Tell her, Mom. Tell her why we are here. It is not a big deal." I stared at my phone screen in disbelief. Their boundless arrogance never failed to amaze me. My mother cleared her throat. "Courtney needs her bridal portraits taken this afternoon," she explained hurriedly. "The photographer wanted vintage glamour. We are just borrowing your grandmother's diamond tiara. It is not like you will ever find a man to marry you anyway, Rebecca. You are always working, you never wear it. Let Courtney have it." The silence on the audio feed was profound. I let my mother's words hang in the air. It was not like I would ever find a man to marry me. That was their defense for attempting to steal a family heirloom. I watched the live video feed as Courtney smirked. She adjusted the lapels of her designer trench coat, clearly believing this pathetic excuse granted them the moral high ground. They thought they had won the exchange by tearing down my personal life. I rested my forearms on the cool marble of my desk. I did not feel a single sting of hurt. Instead, I felt a deep clarity. I tapped the microphone icon, making sure my voice carried through the speakers with absolute precision. "You are looking for grandmother's diamond tiara," I stated, pacing my words to ensure every syllable landed. "You broke into my secure building, forced your way into my private office, and attempted to crack a steel wall safe for an accessory." On the screen, my mother shifted her weight. She offered a dismissive wave toward the ceiling. "It belongs in the family, Rebecca," my mother argued, her voice taking on that whining pitch she used when cornered. "It should be worn by a bride, not locked away collecting dust while you sit alone in this apartment. Your sister deserves to wear it today. The optics are incredibly important." I let out a slow breath. "It is a fascinating strategy," I replied, my tone dropping to a conversational murmur. "But there is a significant flaw in your logistics." Courtney stepped closer to the hidden safe, glaring at the wall. "What are you talking about?" Courtney demanded. "Just give us the code, Rebecca. We have an appointment at 2 o'clock, and we are running out of time." I leaned closer to the phone. "I am not going to give you the code, Courtney. And even if I did, you would be disappointed. The safe is empty." The video feed captured the exact moment my words registered. Courtney froze. My mother's eyes widened, darting back to the brushed steel door. "That is a lie," my mother snapped, pointing a trembling finger at the ceiling. "I saw you put it in there 3 years ago, after the estate was settled." 3 years ago I did keep it there," I corrected her smoothly. "But my business requires me to travel, and I am not naive enough to leave a $250,000 piece of jewelry sitting in a residential wall safe. Grandmother's tiara was transferred to a high-security vault at my private bank over 18 months ago. It requires dual-key verification and biometric clearance to access the viewing room. It is nowhere near that apartment, and you will never touch it." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Courtney let out a sharp cry of frustration, grabbing a fistful of my scattered client folders and kicking them across the room. "You ruined everything!" Courtney screamed at the ceiling, her face flushing a deep red. You knew I needed that tiara. You are doing this on purpose, just to sabotage my photos. I watched with cold detachment. I had tolerated their disrespect for the last time. It was time to establish a new set of rules. I am not ruining anything, I said, my voice cutting through her screaming. You are ruining your own life with your boundless entitlement. Now I suggest you stop throwing my property around because your situation is about to become significantly worse. I minimized the camera application on my phone and opened my master security dashboard. With a single tap of my finger, I engaged the primary lockdown protocol. The response was immediate. On the live feed, a heavy mechanical deadbolt echoed through the apartment. The secondary electronic locks hummed as they activated, sealing every possible exit. The smart tint on the massive floor-to-ceiling windows instantly shifted from transparent to opaque black, plunging the luxury apartment into artificial twilight before the bright overhead security lights flickered on. My mother gasped, grabbing Courtney's arm. "What was that sound?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. That was the sound of the smart locks engaging on the main entry doors, I informed them. You are now securely locked inside my penthouse. The only way out is if I manually release the magnetic seals or if emergency services override the system from the exterior. Courtney rushed out of the office frame. I switched camera views, watching her sprint down the hallway to the front door. She grabbed the heavy brass handle and yanked it with all her might. It did not budge. She pounded her fists against the solid oak wood, screaming my name. "Open this door right now!" Rebecca Courtney shrieked, her voice echoing through the corridor. "You cannot lock us in here! This is illegal! You are holding us hostage!" I toggled the audio feed. "I am not holding you hostage," I replied. "I am simply securing a crime scene. You unlawfully entered a restricted area and attempted to breach a safe. That is a felony." My mother hurried down the hallway, her face completely drained of color. She pulled Courtney back from the door. "Rebecca, please," my mother begged, her arrogance replaced by genuine panic. "We will leave. Just open the door." I looked at my digital clock. It was 10:15. I had a conference call in 20 minutes, and I had no intention of letting this family drama disrupt my schedule. "I am going to make this very simple," I said. "I am setting a timer for exactly 3 minutes. You will walk back into my office, pick up every single piece of paper, every file, and every pen you threw on the floor, and place them exactly as you found them. If the room is not returned to its pristine condition when the timer goes off, I will press the dispatch button. The police will arrive in 5 minutes. They will arrest you for breaking and entering, and I will hand over the high-definition video footage of you attempting to crack my safe to the prosecuting attorney." I paused. I do not think a felony arrest record is the kind of vintage glamour the wedding photographer is looking for today, Courtney. The silence in the hallway was absolute. Courtney stared up at the camera, tears of fury welling in her eyes. My mother did not hesitate. She grabbed Courtney by the arm, her fingernails digging into the expensive fabric of the trench coat. "Come on," my mother hissed, pulling her daughter roughly back toward the office. "We have to clean it up. Now, Courtney, move!" I watched on the camera feed as they scrambled back into the office. The timer on my screen began to tick down. 3 minutes. The elite bride and her socialite mother dropped to their knees on the hardwood floor, frantically gathering scattered documents and stacking them back onto my desk. Their hands were shaking. Their perfect hair was falling out of place. They were moving with the desperate energy of cornered animals. I took another slow sip of my hot espresso, watching them scramble across the polished wood. They had always treated me like my life was a meaningless joke compared to their grand social ambitions, but right now, completely trapped behind my reinforced steel doors, desperately cleaning up their own mess, to avoid handcuffs, they finally understood exactly who held the power. I watched the timer hit 0 as my mother placed the final file back into its exact position on my desk. Her chest was heaving from the exertion, and Courtney was leaning against the wall, her face stained with tears of absolute humiliation. They looked up at the ceiling camera, waiting for my judgment like reprimanded children. I did not offer any parting words of wisdom or gloat about my victory. I simply tapped the unlock command on my master dashboard. The heavy magnetic seals on the doors disengaged with a loud, echoing clack. My mother practically shoved Courtney out of the room, both of them fleeing down the hallway and out the front door without looking back. I watched them scramble into the elevator on the security feed, and then I closed the application on my phone. The silence in my office was profoundly peaceful. I turned my attention back to the financial dossiers on my desk, feeling lighter than I had in decades. True to my word, I did not make a single attempt to fight for my place at the wedding. In the days that followed the failed break-in, my phone remained completely silent. There were no fake apologies from my parents, no angry messages from Courtney, and absolutely no attempts to extend an olive branch. They had drawn their battle lines, fully believing they were heading to a spectacular high-society destination wedding, while I wallowed in misery back in Chicago. The silence in my office lasted less than 20 minutes. Then my assistant knocked once and stepped inside with the careful expression people used when they were bringing me something unpleasant. She placed her tablet beside my espresso and said Courtney had begun broadcasting from the curb outside my building. I opened the social media feed and found my sister framed beneath the polished brass entrance, still wearing the trench coat she had nearly torn while scrambling through my office. Barbara stood beside her, dabbing at dry eyes for the camera. They had transformed a failed burglary into a public performance before the elevator had even returned to the lobby. Courtney stared into her phone and told thousands of followers that her jealous, toxic, spinster sister had trapped her and our mother inside an apartment for no reason. She claimed they had only come to collect a family heirloom that rightfully belonged to the bride. She described me as unstable, vindictive, and obsessed with destroying her happiness. Barbara nodded at every accusation. Neither of them mentioned the restricted office, the hidden safe, the scattered client files, or the 3 minutes they had spent on their knees, restoring the room to avoid a police report. The comments began multiplying faster than Courtney could read them. Her friends called me bitter. Several wedding guests wrote that they were relieved I had been removed from the guest list. One lifestyle blogger asked whether Courtney wanted to discuss the abuse on a live interview. Courtney brightened at the attention and launched a second broadcast from the back seat of my mother's car. This time she held up mood boards, vendor contracts, and pages from her wedding binder to prove how much work I was supposedly trying to sabotage. I was about to close the application when a sheet of paper flashed across the screen. Courtney had lifted it toward the camera while complaining about a delayed payment to the floral designer. It was visible for no more than 2 seconds, but the header was unmistakable. Wedding Funding Schedule. Beneath it were columns for vendor balances, transfer dates, and the source accounts assigned to each payment. One line identified Harrison Family Trust as the origin of a $50,000 bridge transfer. The routing number and partial account number were printed directly beside it. I paused the recording and dragged the playback marker backward. Then I captured the clearest frame and sent it to David with one instruction: verify the funding source. He called me less than 10 minutes later. His tone had changed from professional curiosity to controlled alarm. The routing number did not belong to a private family trust. It belonged to a small commercial bank that had recently filed suspicious activity reports connected to a network of shell companies. The account name on Courtney's page matched one of those entities: Bellwether Strategic Holdings. Bellwether had no employees, no active office, and no legitimate operating revenue. Its registered address led to a mail service in Delaware. Over the previous year, it had received short bursts of money from heavily leveraged companies, paid luxury vendors for a few days, and then reversed or disputed the transfers. Federal investigators were examining whether the company had been used to hide corporate debt and create false proof of liquidity for borrowers seeking new credit. Harrison appeared in the formation records as an authorized signatory through a chain of nominee managers. David shared his screen and walked me through the documents his analysts had collected overnight. Harrison's supposedly prestigious family trust had stopped filing meaningful asset statements almost 10 years earlier. 2 family properties had been sold under court supervision. A yacht displayed across Harrison's social media belonged to a charter company. The office building he described as a family holding was leased by the hour for executive meetings. Even the glossy portfolio he had shown Courtney contained photographs copied from public real estate listings. His wealth was not merely exaggerated, it was staged. The wedding spreadsheet revealed another problem. Several vendor deposits were scheduled to be paid from Bellwether, but the corresponding confirmation numbers did not match completed bank transfers. They looked like temporary authorization references generated before settlement. In practical terms, Harrison and Courtney were planning a luxury wedding around money that had never actually cleared. The florist, caterer, bar service, and live streaming team all expected final payment before the ceremony. When those deadlines arrived, the entire production could stop at once. I asked David whether my parents had already received money from the shell company. He confirmed that they had not. Thomas had submitted a financing request against the Newport property through an aggressive private lender, listing himself as the unrestricted owner. The lender had ordered a preliminary title search and discovered my holding company on the recorded deed. The application was already stalled. My father had not told Courtney because admitting the truth would destroy his image as the wealthy patriarch funding her dream wedding. For several seconds, neither David nor I spoke. The shape of the deception was finally visible. Harrison believed my parents possessed a valuable house and enough social influence to rescue him. My parents believed Harrison's family trust would restore their status after the ceremony. Courtney believed both sides were wealthy and that every invoice would somehow be paid because she demanded it. Each of them was leaning on the next person in the circle, and there was nothing in the center supporting any of them. David asked whether I wanted our attorneys to warn the vendors or contact investigators immediately. I considered it, but the documents did not yet establish who had knowingly committed fraud and who was simply repeating lies. A public accusation from me would also allow Courtney to claim I had sabotaged her wedding out of jealousy. I instructed David to preserve the broadcast archive, the spreadsheet image, and continue tracing Bellwether through lawful corporate records. If Harrison asked me for money, I wanted every communication saved exactly as received. Before ending the call, David enlarged one final entry on the wedding schedule. A $50,000 payment was due the morning before the ceremony. The destination account belonged to a private debt servicing company with no visible connection to flowers, catering, or hospitality. Harrison was not trying to cover a wedding expense. He was using the wedding budget to conceal a personal emergency. Whatever pressure he was under, it was severe enough to make him raid money that did not exist. Courtney was still broadcasting when I returned to her feed. She called me low class again and promised her followers that her wedding would prove which sister truly belonged among powerful people. Then she waved the binder triumphantly once more, exposing the page that had revealed Harrison's entire illusion. I saved the video, turned off the sound, and looked out over the Chicago skyline. She believed she had humiliated me in public. In reality, she had handed my analysts the first clean thread leading into the Groom's financial trap. I did not respond online. I did not defend myself in the comments, contact the blogger, or ask Courtney to remove the lies. I let her audience applaud while David's team quietly built the dossier. The louder my sister became, the more evidence she produced. By sunset, I knew Harrison was broke, my parents could not borrow against Newport, and the wedding depended on transfers that were likely to fail. I closed the application and allowed the silence between us to remain exactly where Courtney had placed it. The next few days passed in absolute silence. My phone did not ring with frantic apologies. My mother did not show up to plead her case, and Courtney did not attempt another disastrous raid on my property. They had tested my boundaries and learned a harsh lesson. I knew they were scrambling to salvage their pristine public image, spinning elaborate lies about why I would not be attending the wedding. They were probably telling everyone I was too busy or too jealous to show my face. I did not care what fiction they constructed. I had no intention of fighting for a seat at a table where I was not respected. Instead of waiting for the inevitable social media storm, I decided it was time to leave. I called my assistant on Tuesday morning and instructed him to clear my schedule for the remainder of the week. My private equity firm ran itself at this point, backed by brilliant analysts who handled operations with ruthless efficiency. I needed a vacation. I wanted to be far away from my family and their toxic wedding preparations. I opened my personal portfolio on my computer, scrolling through the luxury properties my holding company controlled. My eyes landed on a stunning coastal estate in Monterey, California. The property was a sprawling mansion situated on a cliffside overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was famous for its manicured gardens and absolute privacy. It was also the exact venue Courtney had booked for her destination wedding. 3 years ago, my firm had acquired a massive controlling stake in a struggling West Coast hospitality group. The previous owners had overextended themselves, pouring millions into renovations right before a major economic downturn. They were drowning in debt and desperate for a buyout. I purchased their distressed assets for a fraction of their actual value and restructured the entire organization from the ground up. I quietly became the silent majority shareholder, meaning I technically owned the Monterey estate, along with several other elite properties. Because my name was buried beneath layers of corporate shell companies, Courtney had absolutely no idea she was renting her dream wedding venue from her low-class sister. She had booked the estate through a luxury planner throwing around our father's dwindling money to secure the property. I did not choose to fly out to Monterey to ruin her ceremony or crash the reception. I genuinely wanted to enjoy the peaceful coastal atmosphere. As the majority owner, I maintained a standing reservation for the private owner suite at any of our resort properties. The bridal party and the wedding guests would be strictly confined to the lower guest wings and public outdoor spaces. The top-floor penthouse was a completely separate entity. It was a secure, private sanctuary, accessible only by a restricted glass elevator that required biometric clearance. I could spend the weekend sipping wine on my balcony, listening to the crashing waves, and watching my family scramble around the grounds below without ever interacting with them. It was the perfect vantage point. My private jet touched down at the regional airport just outside Monterey on a crisp Thursday afternoon. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the ocean air instantly washed away the lingering stress of the corporate world. A sleek black vehicle was waiting on the tarmac. My driver opened the door, greeting me with a respectful nod as I slid into the leather back seat. We drove along the coastal highway, the scenery shifting from pine forests to breathtaking views of the rugged coastline. With every mile, I felt a deep sense of calm settle into my chest. I was entirely removed from the desperate energy of my parents and my sister. They were suffocating under the weight of the financial lie they were living, while I was simply heading home to a property I owned outright. The massive wrought iron gates of the estate swung open as my vehicle approached the private rear entrance. The grounds were spectacular, featuring sweeping green lawns, blooming rose gardens, and the towering stone facade of the main manor house. As the car pulled to a smooth stop on the cobblestone driveway, the resort general manager was already waiting to greet me. His name was Lawrence, a highly professional man with decades of experience in luxury hospitality. He opened my door and offered a warm smile. "Welcome back to the estate, Ms. Wilson Lawrence," said his tone, conveying deep respect. "We are absolutely thrilled to have you visiting the property this weekend. The penthouse has been prepared exactly to your specifications, and your private staff is on standby." "Thank you, Lawrence," I replied, stepping out of the vehicle and taking a deep breath of the ocean air. "I am looking forward to a very quiet and completely undisturbed weekend. I plan to catch up on some reading and enjoy the view." "We will ensure you have absolute privacy," he assured me, leading the way toward the private glass elevator tucked away in a restricted corridor. "As you may be aware, we are hosting a rather large wedding party on the grounds over the next few days. However, their access is heavily restricted. They do not have key cards for the penthouse level, and security has been instructed to keep all event attendees away from your private terrace." I nodded, stepping into the glass elevator as the doors slid silently shut. "That is perfect. I intend to spend most of my time on the balcony anyway." The elevator ascended smoothly, gliding up the side of the historic stone building. The doors opened directly into the massive foyer of the owner suite. The space was an architectural masterpiece, featuring vaulted ceilings with exposed wooden beams, wide plank oak floors, and massive walls of glass that folded away to merge the living room with an outdoor terrace. The terrace itself wrapped around the entire top floor, offering an unobstructed view of the ocean cliffs and the lush gardens below. I walked out onto the balcony, resting my hands on the cool stone railing. Down below, on the main lawn, I could see the event staff frantically setting up rows of white wooden chairs for tomorrow's ceremony. I could see the caterers moving heavy round tables onto the lower stone patios, shouting instructions to one another. It was a flurry of expensive, chaotic activity, and I was entirely removed from all of it. I was floating far above the drama, secure in my own domain, watching the tiny figures scurry around my property. I unpacked my comfortable clothes, slipped into a soft silk robe, and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I walked back out to the terrace and settled into a plush lounge chair, leaning my head back. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks provided a soothing background noise to the distant commotion of the wedding setup. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the water and painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange. This was what I needed. No screaming, no financial manipulation, no desperate attempts to impress elite strangers. Pure peace. I closed my eyes and let the cool ocean breeze wash over my face. I assumed the rest of my weekend would proceed with this exact same level of absolute tranquility. But my personal cell phone suddenly vibrated against the small table beside my lounge chair. It was an encrypted message. The screen of my phone illuminated the twilight shadows of the penthouse balcony. The caller ID was hidden, but the message preview displayed a frantic, urgent tone that could only belong to one person. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. The text was from Harrison. Courtney's pristine, supposedly wealthy groom had managed to track down my personal cell phone number, likely lifting it from my father's contact list. His first message was a masterpiece of manufactured charm and desperate manipulation. He started by apologizing for the steakhouse incident, claiming he had no idea Courtney was going to be so harsh. Then he immediately pivoted to his actual agenda. He told me he always thought I was the more grounded, intelligent sister, and that he felt terrible about how my family treated me. It was a transparent attempt to play on the insecurities he assumed I harbored. He thought I was just a lonely, neglected woman who would eagerly soak up a few crumbs of validation from a handsome man. I sat back in my lounge chair and watched the waves crash against the cliffs below. I took a slow sip of my Pinot Noir. I decided to play along. I typed out a hesitant, slightly vulnerable response, thanking him for reaching out and asking how the wedding preparations were going. Harrison took the bait instantly. The typing bubble on my screen danced for a full minute before his next message arrived. He complained that Courtney was acting completely irrational about the wedding details. He tried to build a false sense of intimacy, suggesting that only I could truly understand how exhausting my sister could be. Then he dropped the anchor. He asked for a massive favor. He needed a secret $50,000 bridge loan to cover a vendor payment that was due by morning. He promised to pay me back the moment his family trust dispersed his quarterly allowance. I set my wine glass down on the stone table. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. He was attempting to extort money from the sister his bride had just banned from the wedding. I began crafting my responses with surgical precision. I played the role of the naive, financially anxious accountant perfectly. I typed back that $50,000 was a huge amount of money for a freelancer like me to move around. I asked innocent, probing questions. Why could he not just ask his parents for an advance on his trust? Why could my father not cover the vendor payment since he was footing the bill for the ceremony? Harrison's ego and rising panic made him reckless. He needed the cash desperately, and he believed he had me completely fooled. His text messages grew longer, sloppier, and incredibly incriminating. He told me I could not breathe a word of this to Courtney or my parents. He typed out a confession that completely shattered the facade he had spent years building. Harrison admitted that his prestigious family wealth had completely dried up over a decade ago. His father had made terrible investments, and their supposed trust funds were completely empty. He was drowning in his own personal debts, dodging aggressive creditors, and keeping up appearances to secure his place in Courtney's family. He confessed that he was relying entirely on Thomas and Barbara to foot the bill for the entire wedding, and he planned to use his new position as their son-in-law to access their finances and clear his debts. He wrote that my parents were his only lifeline to avoid total ruin. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. It was the most beautiful, tragic irony I had ever witnessed. Harrison was marrying Courtney to steal from my parents, believing they were loaded. My parents were taking out fraudulent second mortgages to pay for a wedding, believing Harrison's family would elevate their social status and provide long-term security. Both families were completely, undeniably broke. They were two sinking ships, desperately trying to tie themselves together, each believing the other was a life raft. And the only person who possessed actual wealth, the actual billionaire who owned the ground they were about to be married on, was the sister they had collectively cast aside for being too low class. I immediately took screenshots of every single message. I captured his admission of financial ruin, his deceptive intentions, and his manipulative complaints about his future bride. I forwarded the entire digital dossier to David with a simple instruction to add it to our expanding file on the Groom. I did not reply to Harrison's final plea for the cash. I simply turned off my phone, finished my wine, and went to bed, enjoying the deepest, most restful sleep I had experienced in years. The next morning brought a fresh wave of bright California sunshine and the inevitable arrival of the wedding party. I was enjoying a late breakfast of fresh fruit and espresso on the terrace when Lawrence, the general manager of the estate, sent a notification to my tablet. The main lobby security cameras were accessible through my secure network, and I pulled up the feed to observe the spectacle. Barbara, Thomas, Courtney, and Harrison had just walked through the grand double doors of the resort lobby. They looked exhausted and incredibly tense, likely the result of flying commercial after realizing their credit limits could not handle a private charter flight. However, the moment they stepped up to the polished mahogany front desk, they instantly projected their signature brand of arrogant entitlement. Courtney slammed her designer handbag onto the counter, demanding immediate service from the front desk staff. I watched her gesture wildly, pointing toward the sweeping ocean views visible through the lobby windows. She was barking orders at the receptionist, demanding complimentary champagne upon arrival, and insisting that their standard suites be upgraded to ocean view villas at no additional charge. She claimed that as the bride, she was entitled to the absolute best the resort had to offer, and she would not settle for basic accommodations on her special weekend. Lawrence stepped gracefully into the frame, taking over for the flustered receptionist. His posture was impeccably professional as he welcomed them to the estate. My mother immediately began throwing her weight around. She loudly announced that they were spending a fortune to host an elite wedding on the property and demanded that they be treated with the utmost priority. She tapped her fingers impatiently against the desk, expecting the staff to bow to her demands without hesitation. Then, Courtney made her fatal demand. She pointed up toward the top floor of the main manor building. She told Lawrence that her luxury planner had failed to secure the bridal penthouse, and she wanted the keys to it immediately. She loudly stated that it was absolutely unacceptable for the bride to be forced into a standard guest wing when the best suite on the property was clearly vacant. I watched Lawrence offer a polite, perfectly practiced smile. He folded his hands behind his back and addressed Courtney with an unwavering tone. He informed her that he deeply apologized for any misunderstanding with her third-party planner, but the resort was operating at full capacity. He stated that the complimentary upgrades she was demanding were simply not possible, given the terms of her contract. Courtney's face flushed with anger. She slammed her hand against the counter, demanding to know who was occupying the penthouse and insisting that they be relocated to accommodate her wedding. She threatened to leave a terrible review that would ruin the venue. Lawrence did not blink. He politely informed my sister, my parents, and the secretly broke Groom that the penthouse suite was not a rentable space. He explained that it was currently occupied by the anonymous billionaire owner of the resort, who was on site for a private, peaceful retreat, and absolutely could not be disturbed under any circumstances. The sheer outrage that washed over Courtney's face was a masterpiece. She stood in the lobby of my resort, entirely powerless, throwing a tantrum because she was being denied access to a room by an owner she would never be allowed to meet. They were trapped in the reality of their own financial limitations, completely unaware that the billionaire they were so furious with was sitting just a few floors above them, quietly enjoying her morning espresso. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the irony. My family traveled thousands of miles to flaunt their imaginary wealth, only to find themselves completely at my mercy. The ultimate collapse was almost inevitable. From that moment, I watched the live feed on my tablet as Courtney's face contorted from entitled frustration into pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed both of her hands flat against the polished mahogany of the front desk, leaning aggressively toward Lawrence. She was shouting now, her shrill voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the grand lobby and drawing the attention of every other guest in the vicinity. She demanded to know who gave the resort the right to prioritize a single anonymous guest over her bridal party. She shrieked that her family was spending an absolute fortune to rent the grounds and that she was contractually entitled to the best accommodations available. It was a spectacular display of absolute delusion. My father stepped up beside her, puffing out his chest in an attempt to intimidate the general manager. Thomas threatened to call his legal team, loudly declaring that he would sue the hospitality group for breach of contract and emotional distress. He bluffed with the false confidence of a man who was not secretly drowning in massive debt. Barbara chimed in right on cue, clutching her designer purse and insisting that Lawrence march upstairs immediately, knock on the penthouse door, and inform this supposedly important owner that they needed to vacate the premises as a professional courtesy to the bride. Harrison stood slightly behind the three of them, and his body language told an entirely different story. His shoulders were hunched, and he kept glancing nervously around the lobby. He was terrified. He knew he had absolutely no money to his name, and he knew that if my parents' credit cards were suddenly declined, this entire luxury facade would shatter into a million pieces. He reached out and gently touched Courtney's arm, attempting to soothe her. He whispered that the Ocean View villas were perfectly fine and that they should not cause a scene before the rehearsal dinner. Courtney whipped around and swatted his hand away as if he were a bothersome insect. She yelled at him to stop being so passive and to act like a man who actually knew how to handle incompetent staff. Harrison recoiled, his jaw tightening, his eyes flashing with a sudden, intense resentment. It was the exact resentment he had confessed to me in his desperate text messages the night before. He hated her, and she had zero respect for him. They were a match made in a financial nightmare. Lawrence remained a masterclass in professional restraint. He did not raise his voice. He did not match their aggressive energy. He simply folded his hands behind his back and reiterated that the penthouse was an owner-occupied private residence this weekend, not a rentable hotel suite. He informed Thomas that the venue contract explicitly outlined the specific rooms assigned to the wedding party, and that the resort had fulfilled every single legal obligation. He offered them complimentary access to the spa as a gesture of goodwill, hoping to de-escalate the situation. The offer of a free massage only poured gasoline on the fire. Courtney let out a sound of pure disgust. She spun around, her eyes scanning the lobby with frantic energy. That was when she spotted it. A young housekeeping attendant was pushing a linen cart down a side corridor, using a master key card to open a heavy wooden door that led to the service elevators. Those elevators bypassed the main security lobby and ran directly up the spine of the historic building, servicing every floor, including the penthouse level. I saw the exact moment the idea clicked in her head. Courtney grabbed my mother by the wrist, her grip so tight that Barbara stumbled forward in her high heels. "Come on, Mom!" Courtney barked, her voice carrying across the lobby. "If this manager is too much of a coward to do his job, we are going to go up there and talk to this owner ourselves. I am not letting some arrogant billionaire ruin my wedding weekend." Before Lawrence or the front desk security guards could react, Courtney dragged my mother across the lobby. They sprinted down the side corridor, shoving past the startled housekeeping attendant just as the service elevator doors began to close. Courtney thrust her arm between the metal doors, forcing them to bounce back open. She pulled Barbara inside and slammed her hand against the control panel. On my tablet screen, a red security alert instantly flared. The system notified me that an unauthorized access event was occurring in the service shaft and the elevator was ascending rapidly toward the top floor. My personal security detail, stationed in a discreet room down the hall from my suite, immediately radioed through my earpiece. "Ms. Wilson, we have a perimeter breach approaching via the service lift. 2 unauthorized females. Do you want us to intercept and detain them in the service corridor?" I sat on my plush lounge chair on the balcony, feeling the cool Pacific breeze against my skin. I took a slow sip of my Pinot Noir, tasting the rich, complex notes of the vintage wine. "Let them through," I instructed my security team, my voice perfectly calm. "Stand down and remain out of sight. Unlock the secondary service door to the penthouse foyer. I want them to walk right in." "Understood, ma'am," the security chief replied. The alert on my screen shifted from red to yellow as the automated locks on my floor were deliberately disengaged. I set my wineglass down on the small stone table beside me. I pulled the silk belt of my robe a little tighter and remained seated on the balcony, my back facing the interior of the massive living room. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls were completely folded open, merging the luxurious indoor space with the sweeping outdoor terrace. I could hear the distant muffled ding of the service elevator arriving at the top floor. The heavy footsteps of my sister and my mother echoed down the private hardwood hallway. Courtney was marching with the heavy stomping gait of a woman who fully believed the entire universe existed to serve her immediate desires. She was fueled by decades of never being told no, of never facing a single consequence for her actions, and of always having her parents pave the way with money they could not afford to spend. She genuinely believed she could storm into a private residence and bully a billionaire into packing their bags. Barbara was panting slightly, her footsteps dragging just a fraction of a second behind Courtney's. I could hear my mother muttering nervous, breathless encouragement. She was telling Courtney to stand her ground, to remind the owner of the prestige of their family name, and to insist that giving up the room was simply the polite, high society thing to do. They were hyping each other up, completely blind to the fact that they were walking straight into a trap that had been years in the making. They reached the heavy double oak doors that separated the service foyer from the main living area of the penthouse. Courtney did not even bother to knock. She did not announce her presence or ask for permission to enter a private suite. She simply threw her entire body weight against the heavy wood, kicking the doors open with such force that the brass handles slammed violently against the interior walls. The sound cracked like a gunshot through the serene atmosphere of the penthouse. Courtney stormed into the center of the massive living room, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with furious indignation. I remained completely still in my lounge chair on the balcony, my back still facing them, looking out over the ocean cliffs. "I do not care who you are, or how much money you think you have," Courtney shouted, her shrill voice echoing off the vaulted wooden ceilings and spilling out onto the terrace. "You are occupying the bridal suite that I need for my wedding. My family is spending a fortune on this venue, and I am not going to let you sit up here and ruin my special day. You need to pack your things and leave this room right now." My mother marched in right behind her, crossing her arms defensively. "You really should be ashamed of yourself," Barbara added, her tone dripping with that familiar, patronizing judgment. "Hoarding this massive suite all to yourself, when a beautiful young bride needs it for her wedding morning, is incredibly selfish. We insist that you relocate immediately." I listened to their demands. I listened to the breathtaking arrogance of their words. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. Then I uncrossed my legs and rose from the lounge chair, allowing the silence to pull their attention toward the balcony. I lifted my wine glass and faced them fully. I stood there in my silk robe, perfectly calm, letting the silence stretch between us. The look of absolute shock that washed over my sister and my mother was a masterpiece. Their eyes darted from the vintage bottle of Pinot Noir on the table to the sweeping panoramic views of the ocean behind me, and finally back to my face. For a brief second, their brains completely short-circuited. They had expected to find an anonymous, intimidating billionaire. Instead, they found the daughter they had banished, relaxing in the most exclusive suite on the West Coast. The silence shattered the moment Courtney's denial kicked in. Her face twisted from confusion into pure, unhinged fury. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice pitching so high it cracked. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, stepping forward with her hands balled into tight fists. "Are you stalking me now? You are so violently jealous of my wedding that you followed me to California just to ruin my special day. You are completely psychotic." My mother quickly recovered, stepping up beside her golden child to form their united front. Her eyes scanned my silk robe and the luxurious surroundings, but her mind refused to accept reality. She crossed her arms, shaking her head with profound disgust. "Rebecca, this is a new low, even for you," Barbara said, her tone dripping with patronizing judgment. "Maxing out credit cards to rent a suite just to upstage your sister is pathetic. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are going to be in? You are embarrassing yourself. Pack your bags and leave before we call the police." I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not bother explaining that this penthouse was not publicly available for rent at any price. Arguing with their delusions would only give them validation. I simply smiled, a genuine expression that only fueled Courtney's rising panic. I walked over to the small console table near the entryway. I picked up my phone, opened my secure resort management application, and pressed a single red button. Courtney took my silence as a challenge. She marched up to the edge of the living room, her face red. "I am not playing games with you, Rebecca!" she screamed, stomping her foot against the hardwood floor. "Get out of my bridal suite right now! I demand that you leave!" Before the echo of her demand could fade, the heavy oak doors of the main entrance swung open. 4 massive private security guards stepped into the foyer. These were not standard hotel bouncers. They were part of my elite personal detail, highly trained professionals, wearing fitted black tactical gear, each standing well over 6 feet tall. They fanned out silently, forming an impenetrable human wall between my family and the exit. The lead guard, a mountain of a man named Vance, stepped forward and folded his hands, keeping his eyes locked firmly on Courtney. The sudden shift in power dynamic was absolute. Courtney froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open as she stared at the giant men who had just materialized. My mother stumbled backward, instinctively clutching her designer handbag against her chest. The air in the penthouse became thick and heavy. The frantic, aggressive energy they had brought into my space was entirely snuffed out by the sheer physical intimidation of my security team. They were trapped, completely out of their depth, and for the first time they had absolutely no control over the situation. I walked back to the stone table and picked up a sleek leather folio I had prepared earlier. I strolled leisurely across the living room until I was standing just a few feet away from my trembling sister. I opened the folio and pulled out a single sheet of watermarked paper along with a heavy silver fountain pen. I held the document out toward them. Courtney and Barbara stared at the paper as if it were a live grenade, entirely too terrified to make a sudden movement. "Read it," I instructed, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. Neither of them reached for it. Vance took a single heavy step forward, his boots echoing loudly on the oak floor. My mother flinched, quickly snatching the paper from my hand. She held it up, her eyes darting across the text. Her hands were shaking so badly that the heavy paper rattled in the quiet room. "What is this?" Barbara whispered, her voice stripped of its arrogant authority. "This is a legally binding behavioral contract," I explained, taking a sip of my wine. "You are not speaking to a desperate sister maxing out credit cards. You are standing in a private residence, and you are currently guests on my property. This entire estate belongs to me. I own the grounds, I own the ballrooms, and I own the venue where you are scheduled to walk down the aisle tomorrow." Courtney let out a choked sound, shaking her head in violent denial. "No!" she gasped, tears of panic finally spilling over her eyelashes. "No! That is a lie! That is impossible! Dad paid for this! We booked this through a planner! You do not own anything!" I ignored her, completely keeping my eyes fixed on my mother. "The terms are very simple," I continued, my voice echoing with quiet authority. "If either of you raise your voice to my staff again, if you make one more unreasonable demand at the front desk, or if you attempt to breach a restricted area on this property ever again, I will instantly cancel the wedding. I will lock the gates, revoke your access, and keep every penny of your non-refundable deposit." I held out the heavy silver fountain pen, the polished metal catching the bright afternoon light. I looked directly into Courtney's terrified, tear-filled eyes. "Sign the contract right now, acknowledging the exact terms of your stay on my property, or my security team will physically toss you out the front doors of this resort, and your wedding is officially over." The silence was deafening. The only sound was the crashing ocean far below. Courtney looked at my mother, desperately searching for the usual parental rescue that saved her from every consequence. But Barbara was staring at the massive guards, her face pale. She knew there was no manager to complain to. The ultimate authority was standing right in front of her. My mother took the pen with trembling fingers. She pressed the paper against the wall and signed her name at the bottom, her signature jagged. She shoved the pen into Courtney's hand. Courtney was sobbing openly, scribbling her name next to my mother's, her complete powerlessness crushing her spirit. I took the paper back, sliding the contract into the folio. "Vance," I said, "please escort these 2 guests back to the public areas. Make sure they understand which hallways are restricted." "Yes, ma'am," Vance replied, his deep voice rumbling. He gestured toward the open oak doors. "Ladies, right this way." My mother and sister did not say a single word. They turned around, their heads bowed in absolute defeat, and walked out the door, with the security team flanking them on all sides. I watched the heavy doors click shut, sealing my sanctuary again. I took another sip of my wine, walked out to the balcony, and enjoyed the truly magnificent ocean view. The sun dipped, painting the Pacific Ocean deep violet. The frantic energy my family brought upstairs dissipated instantly when Vance escorted them away. I remained on the balcony, listening to the crashing waves. My sanctuary was completely secure again. Around 11, my security earpiece chimed on the console table. Vance's voice came through the channel, low and strictly professional. "Ms. Wilson, we have a situation." The groom bypassed the main lobby and attempted to bribe a staff member for elevator access. My men intercepted him. "He is highly agitated and demanding to speak with you. He claims it is urgent." I picked up the earpiece. "Does he have a weapon?" "No," Vance replied. "We patted him down. He is unarmed, but he appears to be in severe panic. He needs 5 minutes of your time." I remembered the frantic, encrypted messages Harrison sent earlier, begging for a $50,000 loan. "Send him up," I instructed. "Escort him to the balcony and remain out of sight." 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened. Hurried footsteps echoed across the hard wood. Harrison stumbled onto the terrace, panting heavily. The polished groom from Chicago was gone. His tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, his tie loose, his hair a mess. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around before locking onto me. "Rebecca!" he gasped, stepping forward. "Thank God! I heard what happened with Courtney today. They are losing their minds, but I slipped away. I had to see you." I stood near the railing. "You have 5 minutes, Harrison. Start talking." He collapsed into a lounge chair, taking a ragged breath. "I need that money, Rebecca. I need that $50,000 bridge loan right now. You have to wire it to the account I sent. You are the only person who can do this. If I do not have that cash transferred by tomorrow morning, my life is completely over." I walked over and sat opposite him. "Harrison, $50,000 is a massive amount for me. Why sneak up to my room instead of asking your family or my dad? Dad is paying for this entire wedding." Harrison let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Your dad is broke, Rebecca. Thomas does not have a dime. He maxed out his credit cards just to pay the catering deposit. And my family? We have been bankrupt for 10 years. My trust fund does not exist. It is all a lie. Everyone is lying." He leaned forward, his hands shaking violently as he grabbed the glass table. I raised an eyebrow, feigning shock. "If you are broke and my parents are broke, then how are you paying for anything? Why are you even marrying my sister?" The question shattered whatever filter Harrison had left. The sheer terror of his reality spilled out in a desperate, toxic confession. Because of the Newport Lake house, he hissed, his voice venomous. "Courtney told me your grandfather left it to her in a trust. It is prime real estate. It is worth at least $3 million. That is the only reason I proposed to her. That is the only reason I am going through with this ridiculous circus. I am marrying her tomorrow, and by Monday morning, I am forcing her to leverage that property to clear my debts. I'm going to sell it right out from under her." I stared at him as the lie finally completed its circle. My grandfather had once owned the Newport house, but it later passed into Thomas's control, and then after the defaults into my holding company through the recorded workout. Courtney had apparently told Harrison that a family trust guaranteed the house would become hers at marriage. He had built his entire rescue plan around an inheritance that did not exist, and a property neither Courtney nor my parents had the legal power to transfer. "But why do you need my $50,000 right now?" I asked softly. "If you are getting the house on Monday, why the panic tonight?" Harrison squeezed his eyes shut, a tear of pure panic slipping down his cheek. "Because I owe money to the wrong people, Rebecca. I took out a loan from some very dangerous men in Chicago to keep up appearances for Courtney, to buy that stupid engagement ring, to pay for the country club memberships she demanded. They do not care about the wedding. They care about their payment. They found out where I am. They told me if I do not wire the interest payment of $50,000 by morning, they are going to show up at the ceremony tomorrow and break my legs in front of the entire congregation. They will ruin everything before I can get my hands on the lake house." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, completely stripping away his dignity. "I despise her, Rebecca. I absolutely hate your sister. Her superficial entitlement, her constant whining, the way she treats everyone around her like garbage. She is a toxic, miserable person. But I have to marry her to get that house. Please, you have to help me. You are the smart one. You are the reasonable one. If you just loan me this money tonight, I swear on my life I will pay you back double the moment I liquidate that Newport property. Just wire the funds." I sat back in my chair, absorbing the complete scope of his vile confession. He had just admitted to a predatory, fraudulent marriage scheme. He had admitted his intense hatred for his bride. He had confessed to owing violent loan sharks and plotting to steal a family property to save his own skin. It was the most despicable, pathetic display I had ever witnessed. I let the silence stretch for a long minute, watching him sweat and tremble under the soft terrace lights. Finally, I let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. I uncrossed my legs and gave him a reassuring nod. "Okay, Harrison," I said, my voice gentle and soothing. "I understand. You are in a terrible situation and you need a lifeline. I cannot do a wire transfer at this exact hour, but the banks open at 8 in the morning. I will authorize the $50,000 transfer the moment the banking window opens. You will have your money before the ceremony begins. You are safe." Harrison let out a massive, shuddering breath. He slumped back, the tension draining out of his body. "Thank you," he whispered, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Thank you, Rebecca. You just saved my life. I knew you were the only real person here. I will pay you back." "Get some sleep, Harrison," I replied smoothly. "Tomorrow is a very big day for you. Go back to your room before Courtney realizes you are missing. Everything will be handled in the morning." He stood up, his legs shaky, but his ego was returning. He gave me a grateful nod, adjusted his tuxedo, and walked inside. Vance materialized to escort him out. I listened to the heavy oak doors click shut. The penthouse was finally empty again. I remained seated on the terrace, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. Harrison left my suite, fully believing he had successfully manipulated the naive, lonely older sister. He believed he had secured his salvation. He had absolutely no idea that the balcony was equipped with concealed 4K security cameras, complete with high-definition audio recording. Every single word of his toxic, scheming confession had been captured perfectly. I pulled out my phone and texted David. "We have the final nail for the coffin. Prepare everything." Dawn broke over the Monterey coastline, painting the morning sky in vibrant shades of gold and lavender. I woke up feeling remarkably refreshed, the kind of deep, restorative rest that only comes from knowing a decade-long charade was finally coming to an end. I stepped out of bed, wrapped myself in my silk robe, and made my way to the kitchen to brew a fresh espresso. The penthouse was perfectly quiet, insulated from the chaos that I knew was already brewing on the lower levels of the estate. I carried my coffee out to the expansive balcony, leaning against the glass railing to look down at the sprawling oceanfront lawn below. The wedding setup was undeniably stunning. A massive white tent had been erected overnight, complete with crystal chandeliers and thousands of imported white roses draped across every available surface. It was $1 million illusion, paid for with empty promises and maxed out credit lines. I took a slow sip of my espresso, enjoying the crisp morning breeze. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire production. Down on the manicured grass, the illusion was already beginning to fracture. Courtney was marching back and forth across the lawn, her bridal robe billowing behind her like a cape. She was waving her arms frantically, shouting at a team of florists who were desperately trying to arrange a massive floral archway. Even from several stories up, I could see the tension radiating from the event staff. Courtney snatched a bundle of roses from a young florist, gesturing wildly toward the altar before throwing the flowers onto the ground in a fit of rage. She was acting like a tyrant, completely unbothered by the fact that she was berating the very people working to make her day beautiful. I pulled up the venue management application on my tablet, accessing the audio feeds from the discrete security cameras positioned around the event spaces. I wanted to hear every single word of the spectacular collapse. Courtney's shrill voice immediately filled the quiet space of my balcony. She was screaming that the floral arrangements were entirely the wrong shade of white and demanding that the caterers redo the entire dessert table presentation. The staff nodded politely, their faces tight with practiced patience, but I knew the breaking point was rapidly approaching. By early afternoon, the atmosphere shifted. The high-profile guests began to arrive, dressed in designer suits and elegant gowns. They mingled on the stone terrace overlooking the water, sipping sparkling water and waiting for the champagne reception to officially begin. Courtney retreated to the bridal suite to finish her hair and makeup, leaving Thomas and Barbara to play the role of the affluent hosts. My father stood near the entrance, puffing out his chest, greeting business associates with a broad, confident smile. He looked completely in his element, entirely blind to the impending disaster. The head caterer, a seasoned professional named Marcus, walked onto the terrace, holding a leather-bound folio. He bypassed the mingling guests and walked directly toward my parents. His posture was rigid, his expression strictly business. I turned up the volume on my tablet. Marcus politely asked Thomas to step away from the crowd for a private conversation. My father looked annoyed by the interruption, but obliged, leading Barbara toward a secluded corner of the garden. Marcus did not waste time with pleasantries. He informed my parents that the final cashier's check Courtney had provided for the catering and bar service had been returned by the bank due to insufficient funds. He stated that the venue policy was strictly payment upon delivery for all food and alcohol, and unless the outstanding balance of $40,000 was settled immediately, his team could not legally serve the guests. Thomas's confident smile vanished instantly. He let out a loud, condescending laugh, attempting to brush off the news as a simple clerical error. He patted his jacket pocket, assuring Marcus that it was a banking mistake and that he would cover the balance personally. My father pulled out his wallet and produced a sleek metallic credit card, handing it over with a dramatic flourish. He told Marcus to run the card and add a generous tip for the inconvenience. Marcus nodded, pulling a mobile payment terminal from his jacket. He inserted the card, typed in the amount, and waited. The terminal beeped twice. Declined. The blood drained from Thomas's face. He snatched the card back, claiming the bank must have placed a fraud alert due to the high transaction amount. He pulled out a second card, a premium travel rewards card, and shoved it into the machine himself. Another sharp beep echoed through the quiet corner of the garden. Declined again. Barbara's hands began to shake. She looked around, nervously terrified that one of their affluent guests might overhear the humiliating transaction. My mother frantically opened her designer clutch, digging through her own wallet to produce 2 more credit cards. She handed them to Marcus, her voice trembling as she begged him to split the payment. Marcus ran both cards in quick succession. Both were immediately declined. The house of cards was collapsing in real time. Thomas pulled out his phone, his hands sweating, and dialed his bank. I watched him pace back and forth, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as the automated voice on the other end confirmed what I already knew. His accounts were overdrawn, his credit lines were entirely exhausted, and there was absolutely zero available cash to his name. Panicking Barbara sprinted back into the main estate building and returned moments later dragging Harrison by the arm. The groom looked immaculate in his custom tuxedo, but his eyes were wide with terror. Barbara explained the situation in rapid, hushed tones, telling her future son-in-law that Thomas was experiencing a banking glitch and they needed Harrison to cover the catering bill just for a few hours. Harrison froze. He looked at the mobile payment terminal in Marcus's hand as if it were a loaded weapon. He patted his pockets, stammering out a pathetic excuse about leaving his wallet in the hotel safe. Thomas lost his temper, grabbing Harrison by the shoulder and demanding he go get his cards right now to save the wedding. Harrison had no choice. He pulled a single credit card from his breast pocket and handed it over his hand, shaking violently. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Marcus ran the card. Declined. The groom was just as broke as the parents. Marcus offered a tight, unsympathetic smile. He tapped a button on his radio and gave a simple command to his staff. The guests on the terrace abruptly stopped their conversations. They turned and stared as a team of waiters in crisp white uniforms began physically rolling the massive champagne carts away from the reception area. The crystal glasses clinked loudly as they were wheeled back toward the service kitchens. The open bar was officially closed before it even opened. Whispers immediately broke out among the crowd. The high society friends my parents had spent years trying to impress were now pointing and murmuring behind their manicured hands. The luxurious facade they had sacrificed my entire life to build was completely shattered in a matter of minutes. I leaned forward against the cool glass railing, realizing the ultimate humiliation had finally begun, and I possessed the best seat in the house. The transition from the disastrous cocktail hour to the actual ceremony seating was a masterclass in awkward high society maneuvering. From my vantage point on the penthouse balcony, I watched the 300 guests slowly abandon the stone terrace where the champagne carts had just been unceremoniously rolled away. They filed down the manicured grassy slope toward the massive white tent, their designer heels sinking slightly into the turf. The low, polite murmurs that had started near the empty bar had now amplified into a persistent, buzzing hum of gossip. These were wealthy, connected people from Chicago and Newport individuals who noticed every single flaw and perceived slight. They were whispering about the missing appetizers, the glaring absence of the premium open bar, and the frantic, pale faces of my parents. The illusion of unlimited wealth was bleeding out right in front of them, and the actual wedding had not even officially begun. Inside the tent, the string quartet began to play a delicate classical piece, but the elegant music was barely enough to cover the sound of 300 confused guests gossiping among themselves. I zoomed in on the live feed from the camera mounted near the floral archway at the altar. Harrison emerged from a side curtain flanked by his 4 groomsmen. He looked physically ill. His custom tuxedo hung perfectly on his frame, but his posture was completely defeated. His shoulders were rounded, and his skin had a terrible gray pallor. He kept wiping his sweating palms on his trousers, his eyes darting frantically toward the back of the tent, as if looking for an escape route. He knew the catering checks had bounced. He knew his own credit cards had declined. And he knew the violent men he owed money to were expecting a wire transfer that was never going to arrive. He was walking directly toward his own execution. The bridesmaids processed down the aisle next, wearing their matching blush silk gowns. They forced tight, uncomfortable smiles, clearly sensing the toxic energy radiating through the venue. A few of them glanced nervously at the empty pedestals where massive floral arrangements were supposed to sit. Courtney had thrown her tantrum and destroyed half the flowers, and the unpaid florist had refused to replace them. The aisle looked bare and unfinished, a glaring contrast to the million-dollar aesthetic Courtney had constantly bragged about on social media for the past year. The guests noticed the missing decor immediately, their heads leaning together as they exchanged judgmental whispers. The bridesmaids reached the front and lined up, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground, desperate to avoid the scrutinizing stares of the wealthy congregation. Then the traditional wedding march swelled, and the heavy white curtains at the back of the tent were pulled aside. Courtney stood there, her arm hooked through my father's. Her designer lace gown sparkled in the afternoon light, but her face was a mask of poorly concealed rage. She had clearly just been informed about the catering disaster. I could see the rigid tension in her jaw and the furious grip she had on Thomas's arm. My father looked equally miserable, his chest puffed out in a desperate final attempt to project authority and wealth. As they began their slow walk down the aisle, Courtney scanned the faces of her guests. She expected awe and admiration. Instead, she saw confusion, pity, and thinly veiled judgment. The 300 people she had invited to witness her triumph were currently evaluating her absolute failure. When they finally reached the altar, Thomas did not kiss her cheek or offer a warm fatherly sentiment. He practically shoved her toward Harrison, desperate to step away from the epicenter of the impending disaster. Thomas retreated to the front row, sinking into his chair next to my mother, who was already clutching a handkerchief and staring blankly ahead. Courtney stepped up to face her groom. The officiant, a distinguished older man hired for a premium fee, offered a warm smile and opened his leather-bound book to begin the welcoming remarks. But Courtney was not looking at the officiant. She was glaring directly at Harrison, her eyes wide, with a frantic, unhinged energy. "What did you do?" Courtney hissed. Her voice was meant to be a whisper, but the microphone clipped to the officiant's lapel picked up the sound, broadcasting it clearly through the venue speakers. The 300 guests fell completely silent, the sudden tension sucking the air out of the tent. Harrison flinched, taking a half-step backward. "I did not do anything," he stammered, his own voice amplified. "Your father is the one whose credit cards declined. The catering manager came to me." "I tried to help, but there is a hold on my accounts." "A hold on your accounts," Courtney repeated, her voice rising in pitch and volume, completely abandoning any pretense of a quiet conversation. "Are you out of your mind? We have 300 guests sitting here with no food and no alcohol. You told me you had millions in your family trust. You told me you could cover any overages. Fix this right now, Harrison. Call your bank and authorize the wire transfer, or I swear to God, I am going to lose my mind." The officiant cleared his throat, attempting to salvage the moment. "Perhaps we can take a brief recess and resolve these private matters," he suggested gently. "Shut up!" Courtney screamed, turning her fury on the poor man for a split second before whipping back to Harrison. "I want answers. My father is humiliating us. You need to step up and act like a man. Pay the venue, Harrison. Pay the caterers." "I am not letting my perfect day be ruined because my family is experiencing a temporary cash flow problem." Harrison stared at her, the sheer terror in his eyes finally morphing into a bitter, toxic resentment. He realized in that exact moment that there was no rescuing this situation. The facade was dead, and he had nothing left to lose. "I cannot pay the caterers, Courtney," he yelled back, his voice echoing violently through the massive tent. "I do not have a trust fund. I do not have a family fortune. I am completely broke." I maxed out my last line of credit just to buy that ridiculous engagement ring you demanded." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the 300 seated guests. People literally clutched their pearls and leaned forward in their chairs, unable to look away from the spectacular train wreck unfolding on the altar. My parents sat frozen in the front row, Barbara letting out a soft, horrified sob as the truth about her perfect future son-in-law was broadcast to their entire social circle. "You are lying!" Courtney shrieked, her face turning a deep, unnatural shade of red. She took a step toward him, her hands trembling violently. "You are a wealthy executive. Your family owns real estate in Chicago. You showed me the portfolios. You promised me a luxury lifestyle." "It was all fake," Harrison snarled, spitting the words like venom. "I am completely broke and drowning in massive debt. The only reason I proposed was because your father promised you were inheriting the Newport house." Courtney let out a feral, piercing scream of absolute humiliation. She raised her arms and hurled her heavy bridal bouquet directly into his face, the white roses shattering spectacularly against his pale cheek. I smiled, savoring the disaster. The bouquet struck Harrison across the cheek and burst apart. White roses, ribbon, and broken stems scattered over the altar. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then Courtney stepped toward him and screamed that he had stolen her future, lied about his family, and turned her wedding into a public humiliation. The officiant backed away from the microphone. Harrison's groomsmen shifted uneasily, but none of them reached him before his expression changed. His fear hardened into rage. He looked at the 300 guests, the empty floral pedestals the cameras pointed at his face, and finally at Courtney. She raised one finger and told him he was nothing without her. Harrison's right hand came up with terrifying speed. The slap cracked through the tent, amplified by the officiant's live microphone. Courtney's head snapped sideways. A jeweled hairpin flew from her veil and landed between the white roses at their feet. The crowd erupted. Several guests screamed. Barbara surged out of the front row while Thomas stood frozen, unable to decide whether to protect his daughter or his reputation. Two bridesmaids caught Courtney before she fell. Whatever cruelty she had shown me, nothing justified what Harrison had done. He had crossed from deception into physical violence in front of hundreds of witnesses. A resort medic hurried beneath the floral arch and examined Courtney while the bridesmaids held her veil away from her face. He asked whether she felt dizzy, whether she had lost consciousness, and whether she wanted an ambulance. Courtney ignored the medical questions and demanded a mirror. When she saw the swelling along her cheek, her expression collapsed. The injury was now visible evidence that no amount of editing, public relations, or money could erase that afternoon. The medic documented the mark, and a security supervisor recorded the names of the closest witnesses before anyone could leave the tent. The venue security team moved immediately. Vance and two guards entered from opposite sides of the tent, separated Harrison from the wedding party, and forced his hands behind his back. Harrison shouted that Courtney had attacked him first with the bouquet. Vance answered that the security footage would document the entire sequence and that Harrison was not free to approach her again. The groomsmen stepped away, unwilling to be mistaken for part of the confrontation. Courtney pressed one hand against the red mark spreading across her face. Her shock lasted only seconds before it transformed into a scream of rage. She demanded that the cameras be turned off. That command came far too late. Months earlier, she had hired a professional live streaming crew to broadcast every luxurious detail of her perfect destination wedding. Their cameras had been running since the guest arrivals. One operator had captured the slap in a tight shot. Another camera had recorded the horrified reaction of the crowd. The officiant's microphone had delivered the sound with brutal clarity. The stream went silent for several seconds while the production director tried to cut away, but thousands of viewers had already seen the assault live. Screen recordings appeared almost instantly, Clips were reposted with captions identifying Courtney Harrison and the Monterey estate. The view counter multiplied faster than the streaming team could disable comments. People who had never heard of my family began replaying the exact moment Harrison's hand crossed the frame. I watched from my balcony as the digital disaster accelerated. Notifications flooded the venue's public accounts. Entertainment pages requested permission to use the footage. Local reporters called the front desk. A Chicago news producer identified Harrison through Courtney's year of engagement posts and connected the live video to my father's logistics company. By the time the stream was finally terminated, edited clips had already escaped onto half a dozen platforms. Below me, the ceremony dissolved into chaos. Barbara pushed through the bridesmaids and wrapped Courtney in her arms. Instead of asking whether her daughter needed medical care, she shouted at the camera crew for failing to protect the family image. Thomas pointed at Vance and demanded that Harrison be released before the guests saw him restrained. Harrison continued yelling that the wedding had been a trap, that everyone had lied about the Newport house, and that he would not take the blame alone. Courtney heard the reference to Newport and lunged toward him. Security blocked her path. She screamed that my father had promised the property to her and accused Harrison of planning to steal it. Harrison laughed in her face and shouted that there was nothing left to steal because Thomas was bankrupt. The guests who had begun filing toward the exits stopped again. Every fresh accusation exposed another layer of the financial fiction. The live streaming crew had cut its official broadcast, but dozens of guests were now filming with their own phones. Thomas tried to confiscate one device and nearly knocked an elderly guest into a row of chairs. Barbara ordered the resort staff to seal the gates and prevent anyone from leaving with footage. When an event coordinator refused, my mother swept a tray of empty crystal glasses from a service table. The glasses shattered across the stone path outside the tent. The family retreated into the main building, dragging the wreckage of the ceremony behind them. Courtney, still in her gown, demanded an emergency room be prepared inside the resort and threatened to sue the estate for failing to stop Harrison. Thomas claimed the venue had deliberately served insufficient alcohol, embarrassed the guests, and created the conditions for the assault. Barbara insisted that the anonymous owner owed them compensation for emotional distress, reputational damage, and the cost of the wedding. They stormed through the lobby with guests and phones following at a distance. Courtney tore a framed seating chart from its easel and threw it across the marble floor. Thomas kicked one of the empty champagne carts into a column. Harrison, still held by security, begged them to keep the police away. He knew that an arrest would expose his aliases, creditors, and the false financial documents he had used throughout the engagement. Lawrence appeared beneath my balcony line and took control with the same restrained professionalism he had shown at check-in. He ordered staff to preserve all camera feeds, move uninvolved guests away from the lobby, and request police and medical assistance. He reminded my family that they had signed a behavioral agreement after breaching the penthouse. Courtney responded by ripping a copy of the agreement in half and demanding to speak to the owner immediately. My phone rang. Lawrence's name appeared on the screen. I answered while watching my sister pace beneath the chandelier, one hand against her face and the other pointing furiously at members of my staff. Lawrence informed me that the bride's family was damaging property, threatening litigation, and demanding millions of dollars in compensation. He added that Harrison was secured in a conference room with 2 guards while they waited for officers to arrive. I looked at the overturned signs, the broken glass, and the guests uploading the collapse in real time. Courtney had wanted a wedding that no one would ever forget. She had succeeded, just not in the way she imagined. I finished the last sip of my wine and set the glass on the balcony table. Send my family to the executive management office, I told Lawrence. Keep Harrison under guard and bring him there as well. They demanded to meet the owner. It was time to honor their request. For a long moment, I simply looked out over the Pacific Ocean, breathing in the salty coastal air. Down below, The remnants of Courtney's $1 million illusion were scattered across the manicured lawn. The live stream had captured everything: the bounced checks, the humiliating confession of bankruptcy, the violent slap that echoed through the white tent, and the absolute destruction of my family's carefully curated social facade. It was a masterpiece of their own making. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy blazer, adjusted my watch, and made my way out of the suite. The walk to the executive elevator felt like a victory lap. The polished stainless steel doors slid shut, separating me from the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse and plunging me toward the chaos brewing on the administrative level. The estate's general manager, Lawrence, had already texted me a brief update. They were completely unhinged. Thomas was threatening to contact his imaginary army of lawyers, Barbara was hyperventilating, and Courtney was demanding financial compensation for emotional distress. Harrison was desperately trying to keep the police from being called, knowing an assault arrest would expose the debts, aliases, and false documents behind his polished image. They were trapped in a corner, reverting to their only known defense mechanism: intimidation and entitlement. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the ground floor administrative wing. I stepped onto the plush carpet of the executive corridor. Even through the heavy frosted glass of the primary management suite, I could hear the shrill, frantic pitch of my sister's voice. She was screaming that the venue was a disgrace, that the security was incompetent, and that the owner of the estate was going to pay for ruining her life. I paused right outside the heavy mahogany double doors, allowing myself a few precious seconds to savor the symphony of their desperation. This was the moment I had waited my entire life for. Decades of being dismissed, degraded, and treated as the disposable scapegoat were about to be rectified in a single, devastating stroke. I reached out and pushed the heavy double doors open. The hinges were perfectly silent, but the sudden draft of cool air from the hallway made everyone in the room turn. The management office was a testament to coastal wealth, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, a massive custom-built mahogany desk, and rich leather guest chairs. Currently, it looked like the scene of a natural disaster. Courtney was slouched in one of the leather chairs, her designer lace bridal gown torn at the hem and stained with dirt from the lawn. Her makeup was streaked down her cheeks, and the side of her face was still an angry mottled red from Harrison's strike. Harrison paced near the window, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his tie missing, looking like a cornered animal. Barbara was dabbing her eyes with a shredded tissue, while Thomas stood over Lawrence, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of false authority. My entrance caused a momentary disruption in their tirade. Thomas glared at me, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, his voice dripping with immediate condescension. "This is a private meeting with the management. We are handling a major legal dispute. Go wait in the lobby, Rebecca. We do not have the time or the patience to deal with you right now." I did not answer him. I did not even break my stride. I walked past my father, ignoring the commanding point of his finger. I walked past Barbara, who let out an exasperated sigh at my apparent defiance. I walked straight past Courtney, who glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. I kept my eyes locked on Lawrence. The general manager offered me a subtle, respectful nod and immediately stepped away from the center of the room. He moved to the side, folding his hands behind his back in a posture of complete deference. I rounded the massive mahogany desk, pulled out the high-backed leather executive chair, and sat down. I leaned back, resting my arms comfortably on the armrests, and looked at the four of them. The room went dead silent. The sudden absence of sound was so absolute it felt heavy. For several long, agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The realization of what they were looking at simply refused to process in their minds. They stared at me sitting behind the desk of the estate's owner, their brains desperately trying to reject the visual information. Thomas was the first to break the silence. His confusion quickly morphed into familiar, arrogant rage. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he barked, taking a heavy step toward the desk. "Get out of that chair immediately. The owner of this property is going to walk through those doors at any second, and if he sees you sitting there like some entitled child, he is going to throw us all out. We are trying to negotiate a multi-million-dollar settlement for your sister's ruined wedding. And you are playing games. Get up." I remained perfectly still. I did not flinch, I did not break eye contact, and I certainly did not stand up. I just looked at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. When I did not move, Courtney let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. She leaned forward in her guest chair, her hands gripping the leather armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Are you seriously trying to embarrass us right now?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with toxic resentment. "You always do this. You always try to make my worst moments about you. I was just assaulted at the altar. My caterers walked out. My entire life is a joke on the internet. And you are sitting behind a desk pretending to be important. You are a mid-level financial consultant, Rebecca. You are nobody. Get out of the chair." I shifted my gaze to Lawrence, who was standing quietly near the wall. "Lawrence," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of emotion. "Would you please clarify the situation for my family? They seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of who they are speaking to." Lawrence stepped forward, his expression strictly professional. He did not look at Thomas or Courtney. He kept his focus entirely on me. "Of course, Miss Wilson." He turned slightly to face my father, who was still red-faced and fuming. "Mr. Wilson, you demanded to speak with the legal owner of the Monterey Coastal Estate regarding your threats of litigation. You are currently looking at her. Rebecca Wilson is the controlling owner of the hospitality group that owns this estate." The silence that followed Lawrence's statement was profoundly different from the silence that preceded it. It was not just quiet. It was a total, suffocating vacuum of oxygen. I watched the blood literally drain from my father's face. The aggressive, puffed-out posture he had maintained for the last 40 minutes collapsed as if his spine had turned to dust. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked from me to Lawrence, waiting for the punchline of a terrible joke that was never going to arrive. Barbara let out a soft, thoroughly confused gasp. The ultimate reckoning had finally come, and they were entirely powerless to stop it. My grand unmasking had begun. I let the absolute shock wash over the room for a full minute. Thomas looked as though all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His hands fell to his sides, the aggressive posture he had carried for decades, melting away into pure bewilderment. Barbara swayed on her feet, clutching Courtney's chair to keep herself upright. Courtney just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, processing the impossible reality that her discarded low-class sister was the owner of the multi-million-dollar coastal estate she had chosen for her dream wedding. Lawrence bowed his head. "I will leave you to handle your private family matters, Ms. Wilson. Security is standing by in the corridor if you require any assistance." He stepped backward and slipped through the heavy mahogany doors, pulling them shut with a soft click that sounded like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. We were finally alone. "This has to be a joke," Thomas stammered, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. It sounded thin and laced with panic. "You cannot possibly own this property. You are a freelance accountant. We know exactly how much you make." I reached into the leather briefcase resting by my feet and pulled out a thick black portfolio. I placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany desk and unclasped it. "You know exactly what I allowed you to know, Thomas. I spent the last 10 years building a financial management firm. I cater exclusively to high-net-worth individuals. I took the scraps of encouragement this family threw at me and turned them into a 9-figure net worth. This estate is just one of 7 properties in my portfolio. Barbara let out a small whimper. She pressed her trembling fingers against her lips, her eyes darting around the luxurious office, as if seeing it for the very first time. "You let us pay to host a wedding here?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You charged your own sister a fortune." "I charged her the market rate," I corrected smoothly. "But since you brought up finances, I think it is time we discuss the reality of your current situation. You marched into my office demanding a multi-million-dollar settlement for emotional distress. You threatened to sue because your credit cards declined and your caterers walked out. You blamed everyone but yourselves." I removed a financial summary from the portfolio and slid it across the desk. It did not contain secretly accessed bank statements. Every figure came from records my companies were legally entitled to hold, the defaulted loans my firm had purchased, the financial disclosures Thomas submitted during the Newport workout, public lien filings, court records, and the recent credit application he had sent to one of our affiliated lenders. Together, they showed overdrawn operating accounts, exhausted credit facilities, tax liens, and commercial loans already in default. Thomas refused to touch the page. "That is confidential information," he barked. "You had no right to build a file on me." "You provided the disclosures yourself," I replied. "Your signatures appear on the workout agreement and the new financing application. The liens and default notices are public records. My firm owns several of the debt instruments listed here, which means our legal and servicing teams receive the payment history as a matter of course. I did not invade your accounts." I finally read the documents you kept signing while pretending no one else understood them. His eyes dropped to the list of dates and balances. The anger left his face because he recognized every obligation. He had not suffered one bad quarter. He had spent years moving liabilities from one lender to another, using each temporary extension to preserve the appearance of wealth. Now the extensions had ended at the same time. Courtney gripped the edge of the desk. "So what?" she snarled. "Dad had a bad quarter. He will bounce back, he always does. And when he does, you are still going to be the pathetic sister who has to buy property to feel important. Dad still has the Newport Lake house. We can sell it tomorrow and pay off whatever we owe. We do not need you." I smiled. It was a small, quiet smile that made Courtney flinch. "The Newport house. The property you were promised as a wedding gift." I withdrew a heavy, notarized document from the portfolio. I laid it on the desk, turning it around so it faced Courtney directly. It was the official property deed for the Newport Lake house. I watched her eyes scan the text before absolute terror settled into her features. 2 years earlier, the original mortgage and several liens on Newport had gone into default, I explained. The bank was preparing a public foreclosure. To avoid that humiliation, Thomas accepted a confidential workout from an anonymous holding company. He signed a deed in lieu, transferring title, received forgiveness of the remaining deficiency, and obtained a subsidized lease that allowed the family to stay while he tried to repair the finances. He told Barbara it was only a refinance. Thomas sank into one of the leather chairs and covered his face. Barbara stared at him, finally understanding why every recent loan application had stalled. I tapped the recorded deed. My holding company purchased the debt and became the legal owner under the agreement Thomas signed. I have owned the Newport house for 2 years. The monthly payments you call the mortgage were rent. I let you continue spending summers there because I was still protecting this family from the consequences of its choices. You cannot sell the property, pledge it, or give it to Courtney. It was never available to Harrison." Courtney let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward until she collided with Harrison. She looked at her groom with desperate pleading. "Harrison, do something. Tell them your lawyers will handle this. Tell them we do not need their money because your family trust is going to clear all this up." Harrison looked terrified. He knew his own financial lies had already been exposed at the altar. But Courtney was clinging to her last shred of delusion. She needed a savior, and she was demanding that he play the part. Courtney Harrison muttered, looking desperately toward the heavy double doors. I told you at the ceremony. There is no trust fund. I owe people a lot of money. I thought your father was going to give us the Newport house. I needed that property to clear my debts. He is just confused, Courtney shouted, turning back to me. He is under stress because you ruined our wedding. Harrison is a wealthy executive. He loves me. We were going to leave this terrible place and live a beautiful life without any of you. The surgical dismantling was nearly complete, but the final incision required absolute precision. I reached across the desk and picked up a remote control. Behind me, mounted on the wall, was a massive flat-screen monitor. I pressed the power button, and the screen flared to life in brilliant 4K resolution. I think you should see exactly who you are marrying, Courtney. I selected the recording from the concealed security system on my penthouse balcony. The screen showed Harrison exactly as he had appeared the previous night, tie-loose hands, shaking, and desperation stripping away every trace of charm. The audio was flawless. He admitted that his family had been bankrupt for 10 years. He said he despised Courtney, that he was marrying her only because he believed she controlled the Newport property, and that he intended to force a sale immediately after the wedding to pay dangerous creditors. Then the video captured him begging me for $50,000 and promising to repay me after he took the house. Courtney watched without blinking. The footage did not depend on inference, an overheard rumor, or an unexplained recording from a private room. Harrison had entered my suite, voluntarily sat in front of me, and confessed directly beneath clearly posted security cameras. When his recorded voice said, "I absolutely hate your sister Courtney," recoiled as if he had struck her a second time. Harrison moved toward the monitor, but Vance stepped between him and the desk. The recording continued until Harrison thanked me for the loan he believed I would send and walked out smiling. I stopped the video. The screen went black, leaving Courtney's reflection suspended in it. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Barbara covered her face and began to sob. Thomas stared at the deed on the desk, finally understanding that Harrison had targeted an asset the family no longer owned. Harrison stood near the window, with every lie exposed in his own voice. There was nothing left for him to reinterpret, and no wealthy family left to rescue him. I pressed a button on the intercom sitting on my desk. "Lawrence," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady, "please come back in." The heavy double doors opened instantly. The general manager stepped into the room, his posture rigid and professional, completely ignoring the weeping woman and the stunned men. "You asked for me, Ms. Wilson?" "Yes," I replied, standing up and smoothing the lapels of my blazer. "Call the police immediately. I want Harrison arrested for the physical assault that took place on my property. We have the live stream footage and our own security cameras as evidence." Harrison let out a strangled gasp, taking a step backward until he hit the glass window. "No, please," he begged, holding up his trembling hands. "You cannot do this to me. An assault charge will destroy me. The people I owe will find me." I ignored his pathetic pleading and kept my focus entirely on Lawrence. Furthermore, I continued pulling a stack of legal documents from my leather portfolio. "Please have our estate security team escort these 4 individuals off the premises. Once they are outside the gates, hand my family these 30-day eviction notices for the Newport Lake House. They have exactly 1 month to pack up whatever cheap belongings they have left and vacate my property." Lawrence accepted the paperwork with a crisp nod. "Right away, Miss Wilson." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 2 officers marched into the management office, their expressions stern. Harrison tried to run, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the plush carpet. The officers hauled him to his feet, pulling his arms behind his back and clicking heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. He sobbed openly as they read him his rights. his pristine, rich boy facade completely destroyed. As Harrison was dragged out into the corridor, the security team moved in to handle my family. Thomas, Barbara, and Courtney were ushered toward the exit. They looked absolutely pathetic. Courtney trudged forward in her torn, dirt-stained bridal gown, her face streaked with ruined makeup and tears. Thomas slouched like a defeated animal, his chest sunken, stripped of his arrogant pride. Barbara clung to his arm, weeping hysterically about the public humiliation. The live stream had captured the slap, and the internet had already done the rest. Thousands of followers had watched their magnificent downfall in real time. They were walking out of the grand coastal estate with absolutely zero assets, zero social standing, and a deeply viral legacy of absolute humiliation that would follow them for the rest of their miserable lives. They had nothing left. I watched them slowly disappear down the hallway, the heavy double doors closing silently behind them. The quiet returned to the management office, settling around me like a warm, comforting blanket. Years of being dismissed, degraded, and pushed aside had culminated in this perfect surgical strike. Justice was not just served, it was orchestrated flawlessly. I packed up my portfolio, gave Lawrence a final nod of appreciation, and walked to the executive elevator. The ride up to the penthouse was peaceful. I stepped out into my suite, the afternoon sunlight pouring through the massive windows. I walked over to the wet bar, picked up the crystal glass I had left behind, and poured myself another generous measure of vintage red wine. I stepped out onto the private balcony, breathing in the fresh, salty ocean air. I took a slow sip, looking out at the beautiful, endless horizon, truly ready to finally enjoy the peaceful, luxurious coastal vacation I had booked for myself. The journey from being the family scapegoat to standing on that penthouse balcony, the sole architect of my own destiny, taught me a profound truth. Your worth is never defined by those who are committed to underestimating you. For decades, I allowed my family to cast me in the role of the insignificant, disposable sister. I falsely believed that if I just accommodated their demands and swallowed my pride, I might finally earn their respect. But toxic families do not reward loyalty, they exploit it. They mistake quiet resilience for weakness and boundaries for betrayal. The real turning point of my life was not the day I exposed their hidden bankruptcy or watched Courtney's superficial illusion violently collapse at the altar. The true victory happened in the dark. It happened during the quiet, grueling years of building my own financial empire while they were busy curating a fake reality for their social circle. True power is silent. It does not need to scream for attention or tear others down to feel tall. When you finally stop craving the validation of people who are fundamentally committed to their own toxicity, you become completely untouchable. My family valued appearance over authenticity and arrogant entitlement over honest effort. They chased a millionaire aesthetic until it quite literally bankrupted them, leaving them with nothing but the viral humiliation they orchestrated themselves. In the end, the very sister they constantly degraded as low class was the only one holding the keys to their survival, and the one who ultimately locked them out. Have you ever been the black sheep of your family, only to quietly build a life they could never comprehend? How did you find the strength to walk away from their toxic expectations and create your own success? Share your story in the comments below. If this tale of surviving family betrayal and executing the perfect karma resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of quiet ascendance and ultimate justice. Remember, the best revenge is simply living a successful, peaceful life